Hi and welcome back. This is Police Stories Podcast and this is episode 53. This is a series of short stories about my 28-year career in 3 UK police forces. As we've heard already, or if you're new here, then welcome back. You might want to start from the beginning, it'll perhaps make more sense. Thanks very much for the downloads this week. They've just progressively got better, as I would hope they would. I didn't dare to dream that they might increase and that actually anyone would listen at all, but it turns out that quite a few of you are interested, so I hope you're enjoying it, and tell anyone you think that might also enjoy it perhaps, so we can continue to grow is good. Thank you. So last week we talked about the dive course. I'll split it across 2 episodes because it is, if I go into detail, it is quite a bit of information. As I said last week, there's a possibility at this point, if you've got no interest in sort of the mechanics of diving and perhaps how police divers do it, then maybe you'd skip to another episode, because sometimes I get a bit nerdy, a bit anarchy and technical, so I apologise if that's not for you. But some people I think will find it interesting. There's lots of sport divers out there, so perhaps be interesting to hear how police divers do things, which is very different, than you would do perhaps if you're a sport diver. So I'm on the course at Northumberland. It's an 8-week course. Myself and a colleague have gone up from the Met. So there's 2 of us on the course. I think in total there was 6 or 8 of us in the course, all from different forces, apart from us 2 guys from the Met. We were good friends before we went. We only became sort of better friends on the course, as you do. Fantastic course, run at Northumberland Police or in Police Scotland in Greenock. They're your 2 options for police diving, as we've talked about. I was at Newcastle and started off on the diving. If you remember, I'd had a bend, unfortunately, previously on my own sport diving just prior to the course. So, as I said before, the instructors were very nervous around me, particularly as we got deeper. But certainly initially we worked in that 7-metre pool and we tried out the different sort of configurations of kits and masks and wetsuit, dry suit. Generally we always dive in the dry suit, but there was an occasion we dive in wetsuit, so we tried those as well. And then when we first went to sort of open water, the best place they could probably control that was down on the River Tyne itself. The marine unit there that we were training at had a pontoon that was alongside the river, and certainly at low tide it could be as low as maybe 3 metres there. And if you were lucky, if you picked a day, there might be a little bit of visibility as well, maybe a couple of feet, half a metre, something like that. And certainly if you were diving in just a little bit of tidal flow, that helped, because any sort of muck you kicked up from the bottom would be carried away by the tide. It was just a very easy sort of introduction to open water diving. And we started off at sort of pretty much slack water with no issues at all. We'd been in a dock as well that had no tide, so that was where we absolutely started in terms of building up. That had sort of a gravel bottom as well, so there wasn't a lot of silt to kick up, so the visibility was pretty good in there. You might have a couple of metres or something, so it was a nice start to your career. But if you'd never dived before, you'd be you were going to get a nasty shock, because certainly initially in those sorts of conditions, you're like, oh, this is quite pleasant, I can see a bit, and easy search. If there was a knife just laying on the bottom and in this nice sort of flat gravel bottom, I think I'd find that. But of course, it was very much a training environment, and it starts you off very easy, and it got, a lot more difficult quite quickly. So we progressed on to different areas. Obviously, we got deeper, which made instructors nervous around me again from a bend point of view, and they were constantly on me about how did I feel and did I have any sort of symptoms etc. of a bend. They were worried that was obviously going to come back. But we progressed into different sorts of waters. So we started off in a small dock, that was obviously still with no tide. Then we would go to the River Tyne and we would dive from the police pontoon, and at low tide there was maybe only 3 metres, but at high tide you might get 6 or 7 metres there. So it was a way of you could dive in the same place but just with a bit more depth to sort of slowly increase it. And some days there wasn't so much visibility there again, so it was quite realistic. And initially we just started off being taught the search patterns, which we will talk about in a bit. But then eventually they would be throwing things in, and it would start off big, it'd be like a machete, a crowbar, big stuff, because obviously they wanted us to find those things to a degree, and if they weren't finding them, there would be sort of questions asked why, and we'd have to look at techniques, because chances are it was down to technique. And that's very difficult for the instructors, to assess, because they are standing on the surface. You are potentially 6 or 7 meters of dark water below them. So really the only way they can assess if you're doing it correctly is if you find the item. Although when we started off and we were in the clearer water, they were able to stand above us in maybe 2 or 3 meters of clear water, so they could see what we were doing, because actually it becomes immediately obvious perhaps that your technique wasn't right, and that was the issue. So we moved on to rivers, with a bit of flow, canals certainly, and canals in the Met was our absolute bread and butter. We were in them all the time, so we became quite used to those. And we went on to some big lakes, then sort of bigger docks, and eventually we progressed into the sea. Now, in the Met, it was rare for us to do a sea dive, because obviously there isn't any sea really, and obviously the River Thames is partially salty depending on how far up you get, or down as the case may be. But certainly as you get towards the coast from London, it becomes more like the sea, but it's still the river. But occasionally we were called on to do mutual aid, so we would move to other areas and we might have to do a sea dive, so we would train for those, and in fact we did several. Also sometimes we would carry out ships dives, and generally they would be in the river, but not always. Sometimes the ships would be coming up from obviously our other countries as they travel the world, and they would have sort of holding buoys out in the estuary, out at sea, down sort of Southend way, where they would secure to these massive buoys, and they might have to wait 2 or 3 days there on standby while they were waiting for their slot alongside the sort of unloading docks up the river. So that gave us an opportunity to get out and dive them at sea, and that generally was sort of a lot nicer sea. But as we progressed in the course and we got deeper, the first thing that happened was I think it was the second week, my colleague that had come up with me from the Met, he finished a couple of dives, and he was bleeding from his ears, or one ear particularly. In fact, I think it was only one ear, but it started off as a little bit. It was barely noticeable. In fact, I think I noticed it along with a couple of other divers and pointed it out to him, and he thought, I've just scratched my ear, I've been sort of put my finger on my ear to clear some water, and I've caught the edge of my ear or something, with my nail. I don't think the instructors saw it initially, but unfortunately, as he dived more and more, it became apparent that it was coming from inside the ear. He was bleeding virtually every dive after, from his ear, which was obviously a worry. And eventually, he had to go to instructors and go, look, I'm going to have to see a doctor. I'm not sure what's going on. I've got no pain, but this is an issue. And unfortunately, he was almost immediately taken off the course and was sent back to the Met, where he had to see sort of specialist doctors. And we presumed we'd never see him again. We thought that was the end of it. And it was such a shame, because he was a great guy. I also had a phone call from my sergeant saying that it's down to you. You're the only diver left. We need divers. You're on the course, so you're representing us now. You're carrying the can, and you must get through this course, sort of thing. So it put a bit of extra pressure on me. So I was very relieved. A week later, he only missed a week of the course, and he was a very experienced sport diver anyway. He came back, and actually he'd been medically assessed. And what they decided was that actually he'd had like a small blood blister inside his ear. And it seemed like that had just popped, basically. And so it was nothing to do with sort of inside his inner ear. It was literally just this blood blister. You couldn't quite see, but it had burst and it wasn't healing. So every time he had a dive, it was letting out little blood. So he was back on the course, which was fantastic. I was really pleased to see him back. For a number of reasons. Firstly, because he was a pal, but secondly, because it just took the pressure off me a little bit, and plus, we travelled back and forth from Newcastle to the Met each week. We didn't stay out there, so we would quite often fly back into London each week. So yeah, I was pleased to see him back. And then when we moved on a bit deeper, we went out to a place called Kielder Water. Now, that's a really interesting place. It's absolutely huge, apparently, and this is a Wikipedia thing for you, so if I've got this wrong, forgive me, but it's the largest UK lake by capacity of water, because it's so deep, consistently deep, even though it's not as big as the other sort of lakes. It's very, very deep consistently throughout, and it was created artificially, by man. It was a small valley, and it had, a number of shops in it, and school, and some houses with residents and stuff, and they identified that they were going to create this massive reservoir, and basically took out the built a dam, took out all the residents and then flooded this reservoir. Well, what that left you with was this huge body of water in Northumberland, with loads and loads of, literally thousands of acres of woodland all around it. A really pretty place at any other time. But one issue it had was midges. Now midges, if you ever visited the west coast of Scotland, they can be horrendous. Tiny, tiny things that you look at them and you kind of can't believe they're actually going to do you any harm. They're annoying, because they sort of cloud around your face or whatever. But it's not like that you feel their bites or anything, because these things are minute. But there's millions, probably billions of them. Kielder Water seems to suffer particularly with them, and we were there in kind of July. Excuse me. So it made a very unpleasant, sort of shore working. And in fact, luckily at that point we progressed to deeper water, so we were diving from a rib from a boat most of the time, so we were away from the shore, which gave you some respite. But even unloading the boat and unloading the boat when you're on the shore, these things were horrendous. They just made your life a misery. And I don't think there's actually a lot out there to beat them. People will tell you, oh, wear this cream and put on that spray, and the only thing that actually stops them is literally like a midge hood, almost like a spit hood like the police would have, sort of made of a very fine sort of denier material that you pop over your head. So yeah, very unpleasant. But luckily, as I say, we were diving deeper. Now the thing about Kielder was, because we went there when we started at, say, maybe 15 or 20 meters deep, so we were progressing deeper, and ultimately we were going to do our deep dives here, which we had to do to qualify. So that was 50 meters. Now 50 meters is the deepest a UK police divers are allowed to go to. So I think that's about 180 feet or something if you don't work in meters. Pretty deep, to be honest with you. And you always did it on air as well. Now you might think that's obvious, but in the diving world, a lot of people dive on mixed gases. You can dive on nitrox, which is like enriched oxygen. You can dive on trimix, which brings in a third gas. So it can get quite complicated, but UK police do not dive on any form of gas at all. They just dive on air. And that has its advantages in terms of ease of use and people being qualified and what have you. But there's definitely some disadvantages as well, which we'll talk about as we go on. But you had to do this 50-meter dive to qualify, and then generally yearly after that you would go and do a deep dive somewhere. And we always had to travel from the Met to do that, because we couldn't find 50 meters depth anywhere in the sort of Met area. The deepest we could find is maybe 20 or 30 meters, at a quarry, but we just couldn't get that depth. So we would have to travel every year to go and do that deep training dive, just to sort of keep our hand in should we be required, because of course we could be sent mutual aid to somewhere else to do a deep dive, so we had to keep trained in it and be trained in it. So yeah, Kielder, and the thing was about Kielder as well, because obviously the instructors like to wind you up and sort of try and frighten you, so they would say, oh, you've got to be careful, this was a village, don't forget, and there was a school there, and if you swim in through, the school door and get trapped in the building, then you've had it, Of course, they knew where these places were, and we weren't diving in those areas, but they like to, tell us these things just to sort of put the frighteners on us, as it were. They also told us about a couple of horror stories in terms of divers. One particularly, when they were at Kielder Water, they were doing some training, and they had two divers down, a diver each side of the rib that had descended to a certain depth and was working on the bottom. Now, if you remember, I said that a dive team is made up generally of at least 5, but probably 6. And the very important role, which most people think, oh, it's just holding a rope in it or an airline, it's not very important, is the attendant, the attendant who actually looks after the individual diver. Well, that attendant has different roles. One is sort of helping the diver dress, if that's need be, and putting his mask on and checking his air and all those sorts of things he's turned on. But he also must report, very important, report to the dive supervisor what's happening with the diver. Is he feeling any signals through the line? Is anything different? The classic was, are his bubbles where you'd expect them to be? If you're in shallow water, it's difficult if you're in 30 meters of water, because obviously bubbles can move. But if you were in, a 3-meter canal, the classic was you'd be holding the line and it would be going out at a straight angle from you, say at 45 degrees. And you would expect the diver to be on the end of that with the bubbles. But you suddenly realise that the bubbles were kind of 90 degrees off to your left. so at a complete sort of right angle to where the line was leading. And initially you couldn't figure this out, but the reality is what happened was you're holding on to the line and you can still feel the diver, and as the diver swims away from you, so you're feeding line out, and likewise when they come back, you're taking the line in just to keep it taut, so you're feeling that contact with the diver. But if they'd gone round a shopping trolley or a moped or any other piece of garbage on the bottom, then their line would be wrapped around it, but they would continue on. So you'd be able to identify from the surface, this diver has, you know, a wrap. You know, they have their line snagged round something. So you'd be able to report that to the supervisor, who could then call the diver and tell them, look, you're going to have to go back because it looks like your line's snagged round something. And also really, really important for that diver to keep that line just at the right tension, not too tight, not too loose. And different divers liked it. You know, I worked with a couple of guys who wanted their lifeline really tight. They wanted to feel it all the time. And others who were the opposite, you know, they kind of didn't want to feel it. They wanted it slack. But you could never be that slack with it, because you create loops, you know, and you also, if you can imagine, if you're dragging along the bottom and there is, you know, shopping trolleys, mopeds, whatever it is along there, if you've got, you know, a big loop of line dragging along the bottom behind you, it's going to snag everything. So you could only go so loose with it. Well, on this particular occasion they were telling us about, at Kielder, they had two divers down, one either side of the rib, which meant they were only about kind of 3 meters apart, because ribs, you know, aren't very wide. And it would appear that one of the attendants hadn't been paying attention in terms of paying line out, or had paid too much line out, and they created a loop. And unfortunately, the loop got so big that the other diver managed, when she descended, managed to descend through the loop of the other diver's line, if that makes sense. And what you basically had was they ended up both on the bottom, and I think it was fairly deep, it was like 25-30 meters down, but both their lifelines were completely tangled up in a big mess. Now, when they were asked to surface, they came up the what we call the shot line, which is basically a big, thick, heavy rope that goes from the boat to the bottom and has a heavy weight tied to it. That's your reference point for sliding down to get to the bottom. Now, at some point you have to come off that rope, but you would need to attach a line to that as well to get back to it, because if you just let it go and swim off into the darkness, you're never, ever going to find that line again. So firstly, you have to be careful that your line doesn't spiral round it, because it's very easy as you drop down that rope without realising to sort of spiral around, because bear in mind you've got no reference points, you're in total black here, to spiral around your shot line and therefore put in a good few wraps around your shot line, which made it difficult. And I think that had happened. I think one of the divers had dropped through this big loop that had been created, and they basically had a total nightmare with their line. So when they were asked to surface and they were coming back up their shot line, which, don't forget, has got this big heavy weight on the bottom of it, basically the divers were snagged and they couldn't come to the surface because their lines had wrapped up with each other and the shot line going down, and they just had this big sort of, you know, snake's nest of lines wrapped around each other, but it was also attached to the weight at the bottom, so it's preventing them coming up. So they tried everything, you know. I mean, now the beauty of surface supply, and one of the reasons why it's used, is the fact that the air is supplied from the surface, hence the name. So you can keep changing out cylinders on the surface. That diver's never going to run out of air as long as you've got enough cylinders on board. Now, you know, for a big deep dive, you'd have had like 10 cylinders on board. Oh, excuse me. So you would, you know, surface with 6 of those cylinders unused, but you had loads of spare air. So if there was a problem like there was on this day, they were able just to calmly keep changing the cylinders and giving the divers, you know, fresh air. So there was never a danger of them running out of air. But as it went on, you can't afford to keep divers at depth for any length of time. Firstly, because it changes completely how many times that they may have to stop on the way up. And it's quite a complicated calculation then to figure out just how many sort of safety decompression stops they would need as they come up to prevent them getting the bends. But also, the longer it goes on, bearing in mind these are new divers, you run the risk of one of those divers getting in a panic. You know, if you can imagine, you're repeatedly told, right, check your line, I think you've got a snag, and you can't move, and you're held in place in this total black water that you're trying to do everything by touch. You know, 5-10 minutes later, which is what it took, they still couldn't clear it. You know, the divers were aware they were snagged with each other, they were snagged with the shot line, they couldn't go up, they kind of couldn't go down, they were in a right mess. And ultimately the decision was made. The only way of getting them up was to haul everything up in one big lump, but that's very difficult because, you know, the weight of all that line plus the heavy weight on the bottom and 2 divers, you know, you've only got limited people on the boat, so they basically had to hand haul the whole mess up. But you can't just haul it as fast as you can, even if you are, you know, Superman. You have to do it in a controlled manner because they have to come up at a slow, you know, reasonable pace so they don't induce a bend. And also, because they've been down a while, you have to give them stops. So potentially they're stopping at, you know, 9, 6, 3 meters for several minutes at a time. All the time they're snagged in this big old mess of lines and what have you. Anyway, ultimately, thankfully, they got to the surface and they were safe. But I think everyone was, you know, certainly a bit concerned about what had happened. And I think the way forward was they never dived 2 divers from a rib again because it was just too close. It was one thing doing it from the shore and you could have the attendants standing, you know, 20, 30 meters apart. But to have 2, you know, surface supply divers going from a rib and the risk of, you know, snagging up those lines like they did, it was just lucky they didn't snag the lines on anything on the bottom, because then they would have had a real problem. But thankfully that didn't happen. But of course, these are all the stories the instructors are enjoying telling you as time goes on, which yeah, was getting a bit nervous for sure. So we got deeper, and we were at Kilda one day. We'd worked up to, or down to, about 30 meters or so. There was another diver on the course, so there was obviously several on there, but one particularly came to me, and she knew that I'd had a bend, so I was suddenly, you know, the resident expert on bends, which is definitely not the case. She just completed a 30-meter dive, and she sort of called me over and said, "Can I show you something?" I was like, "Yeah, sure, what's going on?" And she pulled out the neck of her dry suit, and she had all these bubbles under the skin all around the neck of her dry suit. And I was like, "Oh, wow," you know. And she's like, "Is this a bend?" You know, and I looked at her kind of, "Well, look, you know, I'm not a doctor, you know, I've only got experience of what I had. I kind of had nothing on the surface to show for it apart from a small rash on my forearm. It was more with me, you know, sort of internal." And I said, "I have no idea, you know, if it can present like that." And she was trying to say, "Well, don't say anything to the instructors, we'll just leave it." I said, "Are you joking? You know, whether you tell me or not, now you show me that, I'm saying something, because if that is a bend, for all I know, you know, you could be seriously injured if we leave this. You know, you could have terrible things happen to you." And having been through all the process of the chamber, now the big problem with Kilda is it's in the middle of nowhere. There are no sort of, you know, motorways that connect to it, so it's quite a long drive. So as part of the dive plan, the supervisors and instructors had already considered, what if we have a diver with a suspected bend? And they basically would ring the local RAF base and have a helicopter available should they need it when they're diving. That was the quickest way to get someone to the chamber. Now, the slight downside of that is that helicopter would have to fly very low, because if you remember back from my bend, I got it from going up a series of very steep roads, you know, 200-300 meters up, sort of mountain roads, which almost certainly induced my bend because I was up and down, having done a week's worth of diving. So if a helicopter was to come, it would have to stay as low as it could, so not to induce the bend. But the risk was still felt worth taking to get that person into a chamber quickly, which was really the only way you're going to fix a bend without, you know, lasting issues. So anyway, I said, "So look, if you don't go to the instructor, I will be going, because, you know, I'm concerned that this will cause you problems if this is genuine." I said, "I've never seen it like that. I'm not aware of it like that, but who knows, you know, what do I know?" So sure enough, she went down and saw the instructors herself and said, "Look, you know, I need to show you this." They showed it. Of course, they freaked out. I mean, not literally, they weren't running around like headless chickens, but, you know, no one on a dive course wants to see a diver. And if anyone, it was always me, of course, they believed was going to end up with a bend, not anyone else. So, you know, fair enough, they instigated their full sort of rescue plan, which involved the helicopter on standby. So we had a big Sea King helicopter come in that basically landed at Kilda Water, picked her up and took her away off to a chamber. And again, we weren't sure, you know, were we ever going to see her again? You know, was she coming back on the course? Was that the end of her course? Was it a bend? We didn't know. So it was all happening, that's for sure, what with my colleague as well and his ear. thankfully, after a day or two, she was back. And what had actually happened, amazingly, was now on dry suits, there's generally two different types of sort of material that are used for neck seals, neck and wrist seals, you know, to keep that suit dry around you. And generally it's latex or it's neoprene. Now, she happened to have a latex dry suit, and what she didn't know was she's allergic to latex. So this was an allergic reaction around her throat to the latex, which caused all this bubbling up of the skin. But you can imagine, you know, why they were concerned, bearing in mind, because people have in their mind, you know, bends are bubbles, you know. But so thankfully, yeah, she was okay as well. But it certainly kept it interesting, that's for sure. So as we moved on, we came to the final dive, which is a big build up to it, and this is the 50-meter dive. It's not like you just step into it. You've done like a 35-meter dive, you know, only like a few days before, and they would rotate the divers around so that no one was doing consistently deep dives every day, because again, you can get a build up of nitrogen in your system, and you can't do successively deep dives day after day without breaks in between, because you could again get a bend. So you can see this bend thing is a real issue. And I think the other thing for us is we were flying back every week back home for the weekend off during the course. So if there's any deep diving to be done, we would generally do it kind of like the Thursday, so that we maybe not dive at all on the Friday. So that caused them a bit of issues as well, because we couldn't dive and then fly, certainly as we got deeper. So yeah, we built up to the deep dive, and I was looking forward to it, although I have to say I was a bit nervous. You know, it's a long way down, and in your mind you have to try and convince yourself, look, I've done 35 meters, you know, it's only slightly deeper. I'd probably done about 40 meters privately, 45 maybe, but when I'd done that, it had been in good visibility on the scuba, you know, so I wasn't attached to a line, which initially I always felt was an encumbrance. I hated diving with a line attached to me. You know, it felt so restrictive. But the first few times that you get yourself completely lost and you have no idea which way is up, down, left or right, which happens regularly because of, you know, this black water with no reference points, actually to have that line attached to you and reach down and get hold of it and think, right, that's the line, it's attached to the surface, I can feel someone holding on the surface, that is my attendant. It became quite comforting and actually very important, because if you did swim into the school entrance, for example, you know, as long as you followed your line back out, you should always be able to get back out. And actually, as you learned that, it became quite comforting to have that diver. And in fact, when I later then scuba dived, it felt a bit weird, you know, that you weren't attached to a line. I'm talking about privately. So yeah, we built up this deep dive. It became a big deal, and for some people on the course, you know, whether they talked about it or not, it was becoming a real issue for them. Of course, instructors were helping and winding you up a little bit about what a big deal it was and how you had to do it to pass the course. So everyone was, yeah, getting a little bit twitchy. And I remember on the day we were driving to Kielder, and it was my day to do the deep dive. And you know, through my rose-tinted spectacles looking back, for sure I was feeling a bit nervous, but it was a lovely sunny day. It was glorious. I was in this minibus, I had the window open, the sun was on my face, and Elton John, Rocket Man, I always remember it, was playing on the radio. And I don't know, I just felt really good about it. I was thinking, I've cracked this. This is the last thing I've got to do. And all I've got to do is drop down that rope and go to 50 meters. That's it. I haven't got to do anything special. I'm not being asked to run a marathon. Hold on to the line, drop down to the bottom, stay there till you're told, and come back up, and you've cracked it, you know. And I don't know, I just had a real sort of epiphany, if you can call it that, on the way. And certainly whenever that song comes on the radio now, it always reminds me of it. And I quite often bore my wife telling her the story, and she kind of rolls her eyes and tells me, I know, I've heard it 100 times, that's enough now. So sure enough, we get on the course, we get onto Kielder Water, we get onto the water, the shot line goes in, it gets dropped down to pretty much 50 meters. I think Kielder is about 52 meters at the deepest point. You go over the side, you give them the OK signal, and then a thumbs down you'll get from the supervisor, which for a commercial diver means descend, and that's you off. So you're holding on to this very thick rope in your hand, and certainly the visibility generally is like tea in there. It's really sort of browny, sort of peaty water. So you can maybe see with a torch on your head, you know, like a foot. So that was enough to see the rope in front of you. So I just held onto the rope with my hand, dropped down to the the bottom and just kept going. It takes about 3 minutes, and you're feeling the crush on your dry suit. And the way you stop that is there's a small pressure valve on the front of your chest that you can press to squirt air into your suit. And what that does is just hold the suit away from your body so you don't get completely squished, because you can get really squished as you go deeper and deeper. So every now and then, every 5 meters or something, you put a couple of squirts in your dry suit, continue to drop down, then eventually you touch bottom. Now you may be feeling a bit dizzy and a bit weird, because strange things can happen to you when you get deeper than about 35 meters or so. So you're trying to sort of keep it together mentally. You're holding on to this line, and you have to tell them the signal for hitting the bottom, 1 and 1 made bottom. But now your vocal cords are under so much pressure that you are very, very squeaky. So it's very amusing for those up top, because you call up on the radio and say, diver 1, 1 and 1 made bottom, you know, in this high-pitched squeaky voice, which they think's hilarious up top. And you basically start doing a small search down at the bottom. But the reality is you have very little working time at 50 meters. I think it's something like 8 minutes, and that includes the descent. So you've only got about 5 minutes down there. So you do a little bit of searching, then after a while they say to you, diver 1, prepare to leave bottom. So you make your way back to the shot line, your reference point again, and you stand up and you hold on this big thick rope. And when they say that's it, you step off the bottom, and then that's you coming up very slowly, and you count in your head as you put your hand to the top of the rope, 1, 2, 3, and your hand should now be by your groin, 1, 2, 3, and that's you coming up to the surface. Takes a while, and then they put in at least 3 stops normally from there. So you might have kind of 10 minutes to wait at 9 meters, then you might have, 5 minutes to wait at 6 meters, and then another 5 at 3. So this staged sort of ascent. But ultimately, you come up and make the surface. Now, breaking the surface when you've done your 50-meter dive and it's all gone well, that was a great feeling, because that meant I'd effectively passed the course. There was a couple of exams to be done, which I managed to get through. So that was it, passed the course. A fantastic course, thoroughly enjoyed it, learned so much. But now it was on to the real stuff, the actual work, and we're going to move on to that next week. So thanks for listening. Hope you enjoyed it. Keep coming back, please. Keep those downloads. It's fantastic. Don't forget we're on YouTube. By all means, listen to it there, and you can add comments and ask questions. And particularly, you may have questions about the diving, so feel free. And we'll speak again soon. Have a good week. Take it easy. Cheers. Bye.